Imagine driving 4 hours to your childhood home for a holiday, only to find the door locked and your dinner sitting on the porch in a plastic box. That is exactly the nightmare I lived through, and today I am sharing the whole story of how I disappeared from my family for 7 long years. If stories about standing up for yourself and finding your own peace resonate with you, please take a quick second to subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss out on these intense journeys. Every single time a holiday rolled around, my parents somehow found a brand new excuse to leave me behind so they could focus all their attention and resources on spoiling my younger sister. The final time they pulled this stunt, I simply packed up all my belongings and moved clear across the country without ever giving them a forwarding address or a hint about where I went. 7 long years have passed since that day, and I have spent a lot of time quietly reading through similar stories from others, but I do not think I have ever come across one where the person just walked away without any fireworks. There was no massive screaming match and no dramatic farewell scene at the front door. I simply stopped being present in their lives one afternoon, and it took my family an incredibly embarrassing amount of time to even realize I was gone. My name is Mark. I am 29 years old and I currently live in Boise, Idaho. I only mention the specific city because it is the exact type of place that nobody in my entire family would have ever imagined I would move to. They most likely assumed I would settle down in some boring apartment in Columbus so I could remain within a short driving distance from them and always be available at their beck and call whenever they suddenly remembered I was alive. Let me rewind a bit and give you the background. Growing up in Dayton, Ohio, I was always labeled by my parents as the easy child. My little sister Kelsey started competitive gymnastics when she was just 6 years old, and from that moment forward, her sport completely took over our entire family dynamic. Our weekends were completely consumed by her gymnastics meets, and our entire summers were blocked out for her intensive training camps. Every single dinner conversation revolved entirely around her latest balance beam routine or her new coach or the shin splints she was dealing with. I am not pointing this out to sound petty or bitter because honestly, I really was not bothered by it at first. I actually enjoyed being low maintenance and having my own independence. I read constantly and taught myself how to write code when I was in middle school, and I always maintained top grades without my parents ever needing to check on me. I just assumed that this was how normal families operated. I figured that some kids simply require a lot more attention, and the other siblings just naturally understand and step back. The major issue was that being the understanding one slowly transformed into my permanent unpaid job. It all began with minor things. My birthday parties would get pushed back to another month just because Kelsey had a regional meet scheduled for my actual birthday weekend. I told myself it was fine because I was 11 and I felt mature enough to handle it. Then our family vacation to the beach got cut short by 2 whole days because her coach unexpectedly added extra mandatory practices. I just shrugged it off and went along with it. Then there was the time we drove to visit my grandmother for the holidays, and I had to ride in a separate car with my uncle because our family vehicle was completely stuffed with all of Kelsey and her sports gear. Logistically speaking, I guess it made sense at the time. But the real problem started when Kelsey completely quit gymnastics at age 16, and absolutely nothing about our family dynamic changed. That is the part that truly messed with my head. I had spent years convincing myself that the unfair treatment was just a temporary situation. I truly believed that once her demanding sports career was over, things would finally balance out and I would get my turn. But that day never came. The overwhelming focus simply shifted to whatever new drama Kelsey had going on in her life. Whether it was her very first boyfriend, or the stress of her college applications, or the constant drama with her roommates, or the fact that she changed her college major 3 different times, there was always a pressing reason why our entire family had to revolve completely around her. And of course, there was always a convenient reason why I needed to be flexible and sacrifice my own plans. If you are hooked on this story and want to hear how this wild family dynamic finally explodes, please make sure to hit that subscribe button right now to support the channel and keep these amazing stories coming. During my freshman year of college, my mom called me right before the holidays to tell me that Kelsey was having a really difficult time adjusting to university life. Because of this, my parents decided they were just going to have a very small and quiet dinner with only the three of them. My mom actually asked me if I understood, and of course, I told her that I did. Then, during that exact same year, Kelsey brought her new boyfriend home for the holidays, and my parents told me they desperately needed the guest room. They asked if I would mind sleeping on the couch for the entire visit. Once again, I agreed. Then spring break rolled around, and they secretly planned a family trip to a resort without ever mentioning a single word to me until I saw Kelsey posting beach photos on her social media. When I confronted my mom about it, she simply told me that they only had enough money for 3 plane tickets and that Kelsey desperately needed a getaway. I am sure you can see the clear pattern here. I eventually saw it too. The specific incident that finally shattered my patience happened when I was 22 years old. I had just graduated and was working my very first real professional job in Columbus. I had requested time off from work 2 entire months in advance just so I could drive home. I called my mom to let her know I was coming, and she sounded thrilled and told me she was preparing all her special recipes for the big dinner. I drove 4 long hours and finally pulled into their driveway at 2 in the afternoon only to find the front door completely locked. That was not super weird on its own, but when I put my key in the lock, it absolutely refused to turn. They had apparently completely changed all the locks on the house over the summer, and not a single person ever thought to mention it to me or bother to send me a spare key. I stood alone on that front porch for a few minutes feeling like a complete fool when my phone suddenly vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from my mom. She told me that Kelsey had decided to bring her boyfriend Tyler to the dinner and that Kelsey was feeling extremely anxious about having too many people in the house. My mom said that she and my dad had talked it over and decided it would be much easier for everyone if I just skipped the dinner this year so things would not be awkward. She then casually mentioned that she made a plate of food for me and left it right outside the door. I looked down at the ground, and right there on the welcome mat was a cheap plastic container. Stuck to the lid was a little paper note that literally read, "Happy Thanksgiving, M," with a tiny hand-drawn smiley face next to it. I stood on that porch for what felt like an eternity just staring at that plastic box. I could hear them all inside the house laughing and having a wonderful time. I could literally smell the warm food drifting out through the cracked window. I slowly picked up the container and walked straight back to my car and drove another 4 long hours back to my empty apartment in Columbus. I never ate a single bite of that food, but I kept the plastic container. I actually still have it to this day. That happened 7 years ago, and I really need you to understand that what I did next was not some reckless or impulsive tantrum. I did not blow up at them or rage quit my family. I simply and quietly chose to stop participating in the charade. I let my apartment lease expire and forwarded all my mail to a private box. I completely changed my phone number. I was already working a remote job for a big technology company based in Seattle, so my employment situation was totally fine. I chose to move to Boise simply because the cost of living was affordable and the scenery was gorgeous, and absolutely no one from my past had any connection to the area whatsoever. I did not leave a dramatic letter behind, and I did not send them a final angry text message. I did not even block their phone numbers immediately. I just stopped answering every time they reached out. After a few weeks of silence, I finally went ahead and blocked their numbers and their social media accounts and their email addresses. I only confided in 2 close friends from college about my plans, and that was it. Hey, if you are enjoying hearing about how I took my life back into my own hands, do not forget to hit that subscribe button right away to catch more incredible stories just like this one. For 7 solid years, I have thrived in this new city. 3 years ago, I actually purchased my own home, which is a cozy 3-bedroom house nestled near the beautiful foothills. I have received 2 major promotions at my job. I also met and started dating an incredible woman named Jess, who works as a 4th-grade teacher and possesses the kind of joyful laugh that makes complete strangers turn around and smile. We have been happily together for 3 years now. I built a beautiful and successful life completely from scratch, and it belongs entirely to me, and it is genuinely wonderful. I know my family eventually tried to track me down because one of my college friends mentioned that my mom had called her in tears, begging for any information about my whereabouts. That happened roughly a year after I vanished. Then apparently my dad actually made the long drive to my old apartment complex in Columbus, only to be told by the landlord that I had moved away long ago. After about 2 years of scattered attempts, they completely stopped trying. I honestly do not know if they simply gave up hope or if they just got highly distracted by whatever new crisis Kelsey was dragging them through. I honestly thought that painful chapter of my life was permanently closed. Then last Tuesday, my department manager sent over the official orientation roster for our upcoming new hires. Our massive corporation had just bought out a much smaller software company, and we were suddenly tasked with onboarding around 40 new staff members over a few weeks. As a senior engineer on the main platform team, I was assigned to personally lead the technical training sessions for a specific group of 12 people. I lazily opened the document and started scrolling through the list of names when my entire body suddenly felt freezing cold. Right there on the screen was the name Kelsey Brennan listed as a software analyst who was officially relocating from Dayton, Ohio to Boise, Idaho. Her official start date was exactly 2 weeks away. I must have read that single line of text 4 separate times just to make sure I was not hallucinating. I slowly closed my laptop and walked into my kitchen where I stood completely frozen in place for about 5 solid minutes, doing absolutely nothing but staring at the floor. My sister was moving to my city and working at my exact company, and fate had decided that I was going to be the person forced to train her. I want to be completely honest here because my very first instinct was to just run away from the problem. The panic started flooding my brain instantly. I thought about begging my manager to take me off the integration team entirely. I thought about trying to transfer to a completely different department in the building. I even seriously considered quitting my job and finding a new company to work for. I had spent 7 exhausting years building this incredible life, and my terrified brain was instantly suggesting that I should just burn the whole thing to the ground rather than risk being in the same room as my younger sister. Honestly, that intense urge to run away scared me a lot more than simply seeing her name on a spreadsheet. Jess arrived home from her school around 4:30 that afternoon. She usually walks through the front door buzzing with energy and telling funny stories about whatever wild things her young students said that day. But this time she walked in and found me sitting motionless on the living room couch, just staring blankly at the wall with my laptop open in my lap. She gently set her work bag on the floor and told me that the expression on my face was deeply concerning. I looked up at her and simply said that my sister was starting a job at my company in 2 weeks. Jess already knew the basic details about my family history. She knew all about the blatant favoritism and the years I spent being shoved into the background and the undeniable fact that I eventually cut all contact and moved away. But I had always kept the painful specifics to myself. I usually just told her that things reached a breaking point and I had to leave for my own sanity. She always respected my boundaries and never once pressured me for the ugly details. That gentle respect was genuinely one of the many reasons I loved her so much. She fully trusted me to open up whenever I finally felt ready. Sitting on that couch, I suddenly realized that I was never actually going to be ready unless the universe forced my hand. Before we get to the most emotional part of the story, take a quick moment to drop a subscribe on the channel so these deeply personal stories can reach more people who might need to hear them. I looked Jess in the eyes and told her that I needed to explain the real truth about why I actually left home. So I poured my heart out and told her everything. I did not just mention the terrible text message on Thanksgiving, but I explained the agonizing years of buildup that led to that moment. I told her about the countless birthdays that were completely dismissed and the fun family vacations I was explicitly banned from attending. I explained how I was forced to sleep on a lumpy couch on Christmas just so my sister and her temporary boyfriend could enjoy a comfortable bed. I described the infuriating way my mom always disguised her cruelty as a completely logical and practical decision. I told Jess how my mom would always ask me to be the understanding one because I was supposedly the easy child who did not need as much love or attention. And finally, I told her about the plastic container left on the cold porch. Jess did not utter a single word for a very long time. She just sat down right beside me on the couch, and her silence felt incredibly heavy and intentional, like she was absorbing every ounce of the pain I had just shared. After a while, she looked at me and quietly asked if the paper note actually had a smiley face drawn on it. I nodded and confirmed that yes, they really took the time to draw a happy face on my leftover scraps. Jess immediately covered her mouth with her hand and squeezed her eyes shut, and I could clearly see her fighting a desperate battle to hold back her tears. Seeing her react with such profound empathy almost caused me to break down completely because I had not allowed myself to shed a tear over this trauma in many years. After taking a moment to collect herself, Jess finally asked me what I wanted to do about the upcoming situation. That was the ultimate question I had been agonizing over. In my mind, I really only had 3 viable options. The first option was to formally recuse myself from the entire training team by telling my boss that I had a personal conflict of interest with a new hire. It was definitely the cleanest escape route, but it would absolutely raise a ton of unwanted questions. Human resources would likely want to investigate the exact nature of our relationship, and my sudden absence from such a tiny training group would be highly scrutinized. The second option was to just dramatically quit my job on the spot. It was a massive overreaction, and it was exactly the type of unhealthy avoidance behavior that my old therapist would have harshly criticized. So I completely ruled that one out. The third option was to simply stand my ground and do my assigned job. I could show up to work and lead the training sessions with absolute professionalism. If Kelsey managed to recognize me, I would cross that bridge when I got to it. If she somehow did not recognize me at all, then that would speak volumes about how little she actually cared. I ultimately decided to choose the third option. The next 2 weeks leading up to her start date were absolutely bizarre. I continued doing my regular daily tasks, but there was a constant vibrating hum of pure anxiety thrumming right beneath the surface of my skin. I constantly caught myself silently rehearsing imaginary conversations in my head. I wondered what words I would use and how she would react, and if she would even realize who I was. I had physically changed quite a bit over the last 7 years. I had gained muscle mass and grown a full beard, and I started wearing tailored clothes that actually looked professional. The very last time Kelsey laid eyes on me, I was a skinny 22-year-old kid wearing baggy cargo shorts and driving a beat-up ancient car. Jess was an absolute angel throughout that entire waiting period. She never once tried to swoop in and magically fix the situation or dictate how I should behave. She just continuously asked me incredibly insightful questions. One specific question she asked me truly resonated in my mind. She asked me what specific outcome would actually make me feel okay at the end of the day. She did not ask what would be the most fair or the most perfect resolution, but simply what would allow me to sleep peacefully at night. I pondered that question for several days and finally realized the answer. I simply wanted to handle this incoming storm like the confident adult I am today instead of the broken kid I was when I originally ran away. Monday morning finally arrived. I put on a sharp button-down shirt and grabbed my morning coffee before making the drive to the office building. All the new employees were instructed to gather inside our massive second-floor conference room for a general welcome orientation. My specific technical training portion was not scheduled to begin until after lunch, but I intentionally volunteered to assist with the early morning setup because I desperately just wanted to rip the Band-Aid off and get the initial shock over with. I was standing near the front of the massive room messing around with the projector cables when the large group of new hires began slowly filtering through the doors. I intentionally kept my head down toward the equipment at first. I was not hiding from her, but I needed a moment to focus my breathing. I could hear the typical sounds of excited chatter and chairs sliding across the carpet as everyone found their seats. And then I heard it. I heard her specific laugh. I would recognize that exact sound anywhere on earth. It is this incredibly bright and ascending noise that almost sounds like a musical performance. Growing up, Kelsey always laughed like she was putting on a theatrical show for an audience, even when the joke was not remotely funny. When we were little kids, I actually used to think it was a charming quirk, but as we got older, it just sounded incredibly calculated and fake, like she had somehow figured out that acting bubbly made people adore her more. I slowly lifted my head and looked out into the crowd. She was standing exactly 15 feet away from me, casually chatting with another new employee while holding her morning coffee with both hands. Her hair was styled much shorter than I remembered, and she was dressed in a very sharp blazer that gave off a professional yet friendly vibe. I have to admit, she looked very put together and grown up. She genuinely looked like a responsible adult, which was a silly observation considering she was 27 years old now. But in my frozen memories, she was permanently trapped as a spoiled 20-year-old college student who only cared about herself. I calmly turned my attention back to the projector and securely connected the final cable to test the presentation slides. I looked down and noticed that my hands were completely steady. I actually felt an eerie sense of total calm wash over me. It felt exactly like that terrifying split second right before you jump off a high cliff into freezing water, where your physical body has already committed to the fall, even though your conscious brain is still screaming in terror. The main orientation director loudly called for everyone to take their assigned seats. I quietly stepped off to the side of the big room and leaned my back against the wall while firmly crossing my arms. It was the standard relaxed posture for all the senior staff members who were just there to observe the event and answer random questions. I watched as Kelsey took a seat near the front in the second row. She was totally distracted by her phone and casually scrolling through something with a small smile on her face. If you want to find out what happens when we finally come face to face, you absolutely need to hit that subscribe button right now, because this confrontation is about to get intense. Then the director began happily introducing all the different department leads who were present in the room. He pointed a hand in my direction and loudly announced to the crowd that my name was Mark Brennan and that I was the senior engineer on the platform team. He explained that I would be personally running the technical training sessions later that afternoon, so everyone would be seeing a whole lot of me. I watched Kelsey react in real time. Her head did not snap up in a dramatic fashion. It was just this incredibly slow and profoundly confused lifting of her chin, like she had just heard a foreign language she could not translate. Her eyes frantically scanned the front of the room until they finally locked onto my face. I stood there and watched her expression shift through several distinct stages. First, there was deep confusion, followed immediately by total recognition, and then finally something I was absolutely not anticipating at all. Her face morphed into pure, unadulterated fear. It was not the simple, startled kind of fear, but the terrifying kind where all the blood drains from your face and your brain completely short circuits because it simply refuses to accept what your eyes are seeing. I offered a very small and polite wave to the entire room and told them I was looking forward to working with all of them. Kelsey did not wave back. She did not even flinch. She just sat totally frozen in her chair with her coffee cup held awkwardly near her face, staring at me as if I was a ghost that had just materialized out of thin air. The morning orientation dragged on for hours. I remained casually leaning against the side wall while Kelsey remained completely paralyzed in her chair. Neither one of us uttered a single syllable to each other, but I could clearly see from across the room that her hands were visibly trembling. She finally managed to corner me in a quiet hallway right as the scheduled lunch break began. I was walking toward the staff break room when she suddenly stepped out from a side doorway like she had been secretly lying in wait for me. And honestly, she probably had been. Her face was contorted into that exact same manipulative expression she always used whenever she wanted someone to feel sorry for her. It was this incredibly careful arrangement of fake vulnerability that was scientifically designed to make you feel an overwhelming urge to protect her. I had witnessed her use that exact same look a million times when we were growing up. She used it constantly on our dad and her school teachers and her sports coaches and her various boyfriends, but she had never once bothered to use it on me until today because I had never actually been important enough for her to perform for. She choked out my name and her voice completely cracked in the middle of the word. She gasped out, "Oh my God, Mark." I just looked at her calmly and said, "Hello, Kelsey." She started stammering and asking what I was doing there and if I had really been working there for 7 long years. She took a sudden step toward me like she was preparing to throw her arms around me for a dramatic hug, and I immediately took one firm step backward to establish a boundary. It was not an aggressive movement at all, but it was clear enough to make her freeze in her tracks. She started frantically rambling about how our parents had been searching for me everywhere and how they had been terrified that something horrible had happened to me. I simply replied that I was perfectly fine and had been fine for years. She raised her voice slightly and accused me of just disappearing and demanded to know if I understood how totally scared the family had been. I stood there silently studying her face for a long moment. I desperately wanted to ask her exactly how long that supposed fear had actually lasted. Did they panic for a month or maybe 6 months? At what specific point did their so-called terror just morph into a slight inconvenience before completely fading into total indifference? But I quickly reminded myself that we were currently standing in a professional workplace environment. We were in a brightly lit office hallway surrounded by motivational posters, and there were actual coworkers eating their microwave lunches just a few feet away. I kept my voice low and completely steady and told her that this hallway was really not the appropriate place to be having such a heavy personal conversation. She desperately pleaded with me and asked when and where we could talk because I was her brother. I looked her dead in the eyes and firmly stated that right now I was simply her technical training lead and that our required session was starting at exactly 1:30 in the conference room. Then I just walked right past her. She did not attempt to follow me. I need to pause here and be totally honest with myself and with all of you listening. Walking away from her in that hallway felt absolutely gut-wrenching. It was not because I felt like I was being unnecessarily cruel, because I truly believe I was being completely reasonable. It felt terrible because there was a tiny buried version of myself that desperately wanted to just collapse onto the hallway floor and scream out all my pain and force her to cry and beg for my forgiveness. But that weak version of myself was a pathetic 14-year-old boy who foolishly believed that if he could just explain his crushing sadness clearly enough, his selfish family would finally validate his feelings. I am absolutely not that 14-year-old boy anymore, and I learned the hard way that trying to explain my trauma to them never accomplished anything. The afternoon training block actually went incredibly smooth. I stood at the front and guided all the new employees through our complex software architecture and patiently answered all their technical questions while keeping the entire presentation moving on schedule. Kelsey sat quietly in the very back row and did not raise her hand a single time. She just watched my every move with this totally unreadable expression on her face. She did not look angry at all. It honestly looked a lot like pure awe, which probably sounds a bit arrogant on my part, but I truly believe she was finally seeing me in a completely new light. She was watching me act highly competent and totally respected by my peers. The other professionals in that room were actively deferring to my expertise. I seriously doubt she had ever once viewed me as someone who actually mattered in a professional setting. When the long workday finally concluded, I drove straight home and recounted every single detail of the bizarre encounter to Jess. She listened patiently without interrupting and then softly asked me her brilliant signature question once again. She asked what specific outcome would make me feel okay moving forward. I told her that I just wanted to continue doing my job successfully without letting my toxic family explode the peaceful life I had built. She looked at me with genuine concern and asked if I really thought Kelsey was going to immediately call our parents to report my location. Honestly, I had been so focused on surviving the day that I had not even considered the terrifying possibility that she might not call them. We are reaching the craziest part of this unbelievable reunion, so if you are still listening, please smash that subscribe button really fast so I can keep bringing you the best stories on the internet. Sure enough, just 2 days later, my cell phone started blowing up with incoming calls from an unfamiliar number with an Ohio area code. The calls kept coming in chaotic clusters. My phone would ring 3 or 4 times in a row within a single hour, and then go totally silent for a while before another rapid-fire burst of calls started up again. I absolutely refused to answer a single one of them. For the first 2 days, there were no voicemails left, which strongly indicated that it was my dad furiously dialing. If it had been my mom calling, she would have instantly left a massive sobbing voicemail specifically engineered to inflict maximum emotional guilt, so I would be forced to call her back. But my dad just aggressively kept hitting the redial button because in his stubborn mind, being annoyingly persistent was the exact same thing as actually making an effort to connect. On the 3rd day of constant ringing, a voicemail notification finally popped up on my screen. It was my mom. I tapped play and listened to her trembling voice tell me that Kelsey had revealed my secret location and that the family was overwhelmingly relieved to finally find me. She claimed they had been worried sick about my safety for countless years, and she begged me to just call them back so they could hear my voice because they loved me so much. I sat quietly and listened to the entire emotional performance exactly 1 time, and then I calmly hit the delete button. Back at the office, I made sure to keep my interactions with Kelsey strictly focused on work. I answered all of her coding questions with the exact same professional tone I used for every other new hire. Whenever she intentionally tried to linger near my desk after our meetings concluded, I simply manufactured a polite excuse to walk away and be somewhere else. It honestly was not very difficult to pull off. Since I was a busy senior engineer with endless responsibilities, I never had to try very hard to look busy. But then Kelsey started doing something incredibly sneaky that I completely failed to anticipate. She started secretly spreading our personal business around the office floor. She did not make a massive public announcement, but she utilized that toxic office gossip network where juicy information spreads like a virus. She would drop a small comment here and mention a casual detail there. Within a single week, it felt like half of my department knew about our secret family connection. Coworkers started awkwardly glancing at the two of us during group meetings. One guy from the marketing team literally walked up and asked if we were planning a giant family reunion anytime soon. Another software developer tried to make a tasteless joke about me getting her hired through nepotism, and I had to harshly shut him down on the spot. Because regardless of my private anger, I refused to let anyone question my professional integrity. While all this was happening, Kelsey was actively leaning into a totally fabricated narrative. A trusted colleague secretly informed me that Kelsey had been going around framing our reunion as this incredibly heartwarming and magical coincidence. She was literally telling people that the universe had magically conspired to bring us back together, and she was painting herself as the incredibly devoted and loving sister who had finally located her tragically lost brother. I want you to really process the sheer audacity of that lie for a second. This was the exact same person who happily benefited when our parents locked me out of the house and left my holiday dinner outside in the dirt. And now she was parading around telling complete strangers that finding me was a beautiful miracle. The aggressive phone calls from Ohio completely refused to stop, and I firmly continued to ignore every single one of them. Jess and I discussed the escalating situation almost every single evening. One night while we were washing dishes, Jess looked at me seriously and pointed out a terrifying truth. She said that my parents were absolutely going to show up at my front door, and she asked if I was mentally prepared for that. She wisely pointed out that people who feel wildly entitled to your time and energy will never just give up after a few ignored phone calls. Deep down inside my chest, I knew she was completely right. I just foolishly hoped that it would not happen so soon. It happened on a regular Thursday evening. I had just survived an incredibly exhausting day filled with back-to-back stressful meetings, and by the time 5 o'clock rolled around, my brain felt completely fried. Jess and I had a lovely plan to just cook some simple tacos and veg out in front of the television for the night. It was supposed to be a perfectly normal and relaxing evening. I pulled my truck into my neighborhood driveway at exactly 5:15 and immediately spotted a strange silver car parked directly on the street right in front of my property. It had Ohio license plates. I kept the engine running and just sat inside my cab for a long minute watching two familiar silhouettes shift around inside the front seats. Finally, both of my parents slowly stepped out onto the sidewalk. My dad looked significantly older than I remembered. His hair had turned completely gray, and he had lost a noticeable amount of weight, which made his casual clothes look baggy and awkward. My mom, on the other hand, looked almost exactly the same, which somehow made the situation feel infinitely worse. She was literally wearing the exact same beige sweater she used to wear when I was a teenager, and she was clutching her purse tightly against her chest like it was a protective shield. I slowly killed the engine and stepped out into the cool evening air. My mom immediately gasped my name and took a frantic step toward my driveway, exclaiming, "Thank God they finally found me." I coldly demanded to know how on earth they managed to get my private home address. She nervously admitted that Kelsey had dug through the confidential employee directory to find my location because she was just trying to be helpful. I scoffed loudly and muttered, "Of course she was." I crossed my arms and firmly told them both that they were absolutely not welcome on my property and that I never invited them or gave them permission to ambush my home. My dad puffed up his chest, and his voice sounded much deeper and rougher as he demanded to know where my manners were. He loudly proclaimed that they had been worried completely sick for 7 long years. I stared right back at him and calmly stated that I was perfectly alive and doing just fine, living the amazing life I built after they made it painfully obvious that I was not welcome in theirs. My mom instantly deployed her classic trembling voice tactic and whined that my words were totally unfair. It was the exact same emotional manipulation tone that used to successfully break my spirit every single time when I was young. She swore up and down that they never once told me I was not part of the family. I coldly replied that they never actually needed to say the words out loud because they proved it with their actions every single day of my life. Before we get to the final explosive showdown at the hotel, you need to hit that subscribe button right now because you are not going to believe how this all wraps up. She desperately started begging me to just let them come inside the house so we could all sit down and talk things through. Just then, my front door swung open and Jess stepped out onto the wooden porch. She casually asked if everything was okay out in the yard. Her voice was incredibly calm and polite, but I could clearly hear the fierce protective steel hidden right underneath her tone. My parents looked completely stunned as they stared at her and then glanced back at me. I introduced her as Jess and clearly stated that she was my girlfriend and that she officially lived in this house with me. I literally watched my mom cycle through 4 completely different expressions of shock. She practically whispered that I had a girlfriend and a beautiful home, and then she started sputtering about why I never told them because they could have helped. I cut her off instantly and asked what exactly they could have possibly helped with, and she completely failed to finish her sentence. Jess slowly walked down the wooden steps and calmly positioned herself right beside me. She did not try to cause a massive scene or escalate the drama. She was just a solid pillar of quiet support. She looked directly at my flustered parents and politely informed them that it was getting quite late in the evening. She firmly stated that if I eventually wanted to have a real conversation with them, I would be the one to choose the time and the place, but she made it abundantly clear that tonight was absolutely not going to be that night. My dad immediately turned bright red with pure anger and snapped that with all due respect, this was a private family matter that did not concern her. Jess did not even blink. She smoothly countered that if this was truly a family matter, then I would handle it as family whenever I was ready. But she pointed out that they were currently trespassing on our private driveway without an invitation, so for tonight, she was choosing to handle the situation as a homeowner protecting her property. I glanced at Jess and then looked back at my speechless parents. I firmly agreed with her and told them they needed to leave immediately. I promised that if I ever felt the desire to speak with them, I would be the one to reach out first. My mom immediately burst into loud, dramatic tears while my dad awkwardly placed a heavy hand on her shoulder and physically guided her back toward their rental car. He did not even bother to look in my direction as he opened the passenger door for her. Right before he climbed into the driver's seat, he turned around and gruffly announced that they were currently staying at the local hotel down by the highway in room 214, just in case I magically changed my mind. Then they finally drove away into the night. I stood frozen in my driveway long after their red taillights completely vanished into the darkness. Jess quietly stood by my side the entire time until she gently broke the silence by asking if we were still going to eat tacos. I took a deep breath and agreed that we absolutely needed tacos. I did not manage to sleep a single wink that entire night. Jess peacefully drifted off to sleep around 11, but I just laid there in the dark, obsessively replaying the bizarre encounter over and over in my head. I kept seeing the complete shock on my mom's face and hearing the gruff anger in my dad's voice. I kept picturing the way they stared at my beautiful house as if they simply could not compute the fact that I had become highly successful without their permission. But the most unsettling part of the entire night was not a feeling of heavy guilt. It was the absolute lack of any guilt whatsoever. I had stood there and watched my own mother sob uncontrollably in my front yard, and my only emotional response was profound annoyance. I had spent so many years training my brain to stop needing their approval that their emotional pain completely failed to shatter me the way a normal son probably would have been shattered. When morning finally broke, I rolled out of bed and brewed a large pot of dark coffee. Jess walked into the kitchen about an hour later and found me staring out the window. She took one look at my face and calmly stated that I was going to drive over and confront them today. It was not a question at all. I nodded and admitted that I really had to do it. I explained that I was not doing it to give them closure, but I was doing it purely for my own sanity, because if I did not clearly lay out my boundaries, they were just going to keep ambushing my life and turn this into a permanent harassment campaign. She offered to come with me for support, but I politely declined and thanked her for being so amazing. I drove my truck straight to the hotel and found room 214. I knocked firmly on the heavy door, and my mom yanked it open in roughly 3 seconds flat, which proved she had literally been sitting right next to it, just waiting for me. She was actually still wearing the exact same clothes from the night before. My dad was sitting stiffly at the tiny desk near the window, clenching a cheap foam cup of coffee. Their luggage was unzipped on the floor, but barely touched. My mom immediately gasped my name and aggressively reached out to grab me, but I smoothly stepped past her and refused to return the embrace. I grabbed the heavy wooden desk chair and dragged it right into the dead center of the room and sat down facing them. My mom nervously perched herself on the very edge of the mattress, while my dad remained glued to his spot. I looked at both of them and firmly stated that we were going to talk, but I demanded that they keep their mouths shut and actually listen to my words, because I was only going to explain this situation one single time. My mom instantly interrupted and whined that they were listening, but I sharply corrected her. I told her that she was not listening, but simply waiting for me to pause so she could launch into her own defensive arguments. I demanded that they truly hear my words. My dad slowly set his coffee cup down and quietly told me to go ahead. I took a massive deep breath and finally unleashed 7 years of buried truth. I told them that I did not run away because of one isolated bad day. I explained that I left because of their lifelong toxic pattern of behavior. I reminded them how my entire childhood and young adult life was completely hijacked to accommodate everything Kelsey ever wanted. I pointed out that every single time my basic needs clashed with her absolute comfort, I was the one who was violently shoved aside without a second thought, and I specifically called them out on their favorite manipulation tactic. I told them that their most effective weapon was the fact that they never presented my sacrifices as a choice. They always disguised their blatant favoritism as pure logic. I reminded them of all the times they claimed there were not enough tickets, or not enough room, or that Kelsey was suffering from some invisible crisis. I told them that they made their excuses sound so incredibly reasonable that I actually felt like a crazy person for feeling deeply hurt by their rejection. My mom's eyes started filling with heavy tears as she tried to argue that they never intended to act that way, but I loudly reminded her that I specifically asked her to just listen. She bit her lip and slowly nodded in defeat. I explained how I wasted my entire youth genuinely believing that I was the core problem in the family and that I was just being far too sensitive. And then I brought up the final straw. I reminded them about how I drove 4 agonizing hours to see them for the holidays, only to find the door completely bolted shut and a pathetic plate of leftovers sitting in the dirt. The hotel room went completely dead silent. I stared at them and asked if they even remembered that specific day. When they did not answer, I intensely studied their faces. My mom furrowed her brow as she frantically tried to search her memory banks to figure out which exact holiday I was referring to. My dad just continued to stare blankly at the carpet. I specifically mentioned the plastic container and asked if they recalled the Tupperware box. My mom slowly shook her head in a daze. She was not denying that it happened, but she genuinely could not even remember doing it, which honestly made the reality feel so much more devastating. I laid out every single agonizing detail of that day. I reminded her about the specific text message she sent while I was freezing on the porch. I reminded her how she explicitly told me that her precious daughter and her boyfriend needed more space. I described the cheap plastic container sitting on the welcome mat with a sticky note that said "Happy Holidays" with a mocking little smiley face drawn on it. I told them how I could literally hear them laughing warmly inside the house while I stood outside like trash. My mom suddenly gasped and buried her face completely in her shaking hands. I forcefully told them how I had to drive 4 hours back to my empty apartment completely alone on a major holiday, and that the cheap plastic box was the final gift they ever bothered to give me. My dad suddenly cleared his throat, and his voice sounded incredibly rough as he tried to defend them by claiming that it was just one single mistake. I instantly fired back and told him that it was absolutely not just one mistake, but it was the exact same mistake they made every single day of my life. I explained that it was just the very first time they physically placed their total disregard into a plastic box where I could actually hold it in my hands and clearly see exactly what it was. I told them that they cooked a beautiful, massive feast for their golden daughter, and they threw their own son a pathetic doggy bag and actually had the absolute nerve to draw a happy face on it. The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the hallway ice machine. I lowered my voice and calmly explained that I did not vanish just to cause them pain. I explained that I finally walked away because I realized that the massive space they constantly cleared out for Kelsey was a permanent arrangement. I knew deep down that their behavior was never going to change, and I absolutely refused to spend the rest of my life standing outside on a cold porch, just waiting and praying for someone to finally unlock the door. My mom was fully sobbing at this point. It was the ugly kind of crying where you literally cannot catch your breath to speak. My dad was aggressively gripping the edges of his wooden desk so tightly that his knuckles were turning completely white. I proudly told them about the incredible new life I had constructed in Boise. I told them about my beautiful home and my highly successful career and the amazing woman who actually loves me and the wonderful friends who genuinely treat me like I am a valuable human being. I made sure they understood that I did not achieve all of this just to spite them. I built my new life purely because I desperately needed to experience what it actually felt like to be someone's first priority instead of always being their absolute last resort. My dad finally looked up at me with bright red eyes and quietly asked what exactly I wanted them to do now. I firmly told them that I wanted them to pack up their bags and drive all the way back to Ohio. I instructed them to spend some serious time quietly reflecting on everything I had just said instead of immediately launching a defensive counterattack. I told them that if they ever managed to genuinely comprehend the massive emotional damage they caused, instead of just feeling sorry for themselves because they got caught, then maybe years down the line, we might be able to have another brief conversation. My mom choked on her tears and desperately asked what was going to happen with Kelsey. I calmly stated that since we were forced to work at the exact same company, I would remain completely professional during business hours. But I firmly clarified that she was absolutely not my sister right now. She was just a random co-worker, and she desperately needed to learn how to respect that strict boundary. I slowly stood up from the chair to leave. My mom frantically reached out and grabbed my hand, and I actually allowed her to hold it for just a few seconds. Her fingers felt freezing cold against my skin. She sobbed and swore that she truly loved me, and she admitted she knew her words could not magically fix the past. I looked down at her and softly replied that I knew she really did love me, and that twisted reality was exactly what made my entire childhood so incredibly confusing and painful. Then I turned around and walked out of the room forever. I drove straight to the office and sat alone in my truck in the parking garage for 10 solid minutes, just resting my heavy forehead against the steering wheel to process the adrenaline crash before forcing myself to walk inside and do my job. But what I completely failed to realize was that while I was busy pouring my heart out at the hotel, Kelsey had been incredibly busy scheming behind my back. I found out the hard way at 2:15 that afternoon when I suddenly received an urgent private message from Human Resources demanding that I attend a mandatory confidential meeting at 3 o'clock. The subject line mentioned a formal workplace concern. I knew exactly what was happening instantly. I walked into the third-floor conference room and found the HR director sitting at the table with her laptop open and a legal pad covered in messy notes. She thanked me for coming and tried to frame the meeting as super casual by claiming that nobody was in actual trouble yet. She explained that a brand new employee had officially filed a serious complaint regarding my behavior during the training sessions. The complaint alleged that I had a hidden personal relationship with the trainee and that I was aggressively using my power to treat her terribly by acting totally cold and dismissive. I simply nodded my head and calmly confessed that the complaining employee was in fact my estranged sister. I took full responsibility for not officially reporting our biological connection the second I saw her name on the roster, and I offered a sincere apology for that oversight. The director looked genuinely shocked because she was clearly bracing for me to completely deny the explosive allegations. She then asked me to explain the exact nature of our toxic relationship and how it was polluting the work environment. I kept my voice completely level and explained that my sister and I had been totally estranged for 7 entire years and that her getting hired here was nothing more than a freak accident of the universe. I explained that I made a conscious choice to remain highly professional and treat her exactly like I treated every single other person in the training program. I noted that if she was personally misinterpreting my standard professional boundaries as cruel and cold behavior, I could sort of understand her confusion, but I adamantly swore that I had not treated her any differently than the rest of the group. I even confidently invited the director to go interview every single other person in the class to verify my story. The director scribbled some notes and admitted that absolutely no one else had reported any unfair behavior on my part. I then politely asked if Kelsey had bothered to explain exactly why we had not spoken in 7 years. The director hesitated awkwardly before revealing that Kelsey simply referred to it as a silly little family misunderstanding that I had foolishly blown totally out of proportion. I let that utterly ridiculous statement hang heavily in the silent air between us. A silly little misunderstanding that resulted in 7 years of total silence and moving thousands of miles away because of a plastic box on a porch. I formally requested to be permanently removed from her specific training track, not because I felt guilty of any actual wrongdoing, but because her childish inability to handle professional boundaries was obviously going to cause endless drama. The director totally agreed that my solution was highly reasonable and promised to organize the switch. Before I walked out the door, I turned back and firmly reminded the director that I had maintained a flawless record at this company for 6 straight years without a single conflict or complaint. I boldly suggested that whatever garbage story Kelsey was trying to spin about a minor misunderstanding, she might want to seriously consider the logical fact that the person who successfully relocated thousands of miles away to escape the situation was probably not the villain of the story. I marched out into the empty hallway with my blood boiling in my veins. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and it was a nasty text message from my dad. He angrily typed that my mother had not stopped sobbing since I left the hotel, and he sarcastically stated that he hoped I was incredibly proud of the damage I had caused. I stared at the vicious words for a moment, but refused to reply and refused to delete it. That single hateful message was all the absolute proof I ever needed to confirm that he had not actually absorbed a single word of my painful truth. The official HR investigation totally wrapped up 3 days later. They concluded that I was completely innocent of any wrongdoing, and there was zero proof of any unfair treatment. Every single coworker they interviewed praised my total professionalism. Kelsey, on the other hand, received a highly embarrassing formal reprimand regarding her blatant abuse of the complaint system, and she was immediately transferred to a totally different training group run by another senior engineer who famously took absolutely zero nonsense from anyone. I am not sure exactly what they said to her during that reprimand, but her toxic attitude completely vanished overnight. She completely stopped telling random coworkers that we were related, and she totally stopped trying to awkwardly hover around my desk. She even started eating her lunch in total isolation instead of invading the main break room where I usually sat. For a solid week, it actually felt like the nightmare was finally over. But then she managed to corner me in the dark concrete parking garage on a Wednesday evening as I was walking to my truck. She was physically leaning against a cement pillar right next to my vehicle, and her face looked puffy and red, like she had been crying for hours. She weakly demanded that we talk immediately, but not as co-workers, but as siblings. I stopped a few feet away and reminded her that I had explicitly established firm boundaries that she was currently violating. She admitted she was wrong for running to HR and offered a pathetic apology, but then she instantly started playing the massive victim again. She cried that I totally refused to speak to her or our parents, and that she was slowly losing her mind, trying to figure out what horrible crime she had committed to deserve such cruel punishment. She practically screamed that I had vanished into thin air and that our mom had cried on every single holiday for 2 straight years. I stared at her and coldly asked which exact holidays she was referring to. I specifically asked if our mom was crying during the holidays that I was actually invited to attend. That verbal strike landed perfectly. I literally watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. She blinked rapidly and her mouth hung wide open in complete confusion as she asked what on earth I was talking about. I asked her if anyone in the family had ever actually told her the real reason why I left town. She foolishly claimed that our mom told her I had suffered a massive mental breakdown and just needed some space to heal. I let out a bitter laugh, because of course they had invented a totally fake story to protect their own fragile egos. It was so much easier for them to completely blame my imaginary mental illness rather than admit that they had systematically abused and excluded me until I finally snapped. I looked her in the eyes and firmly stated that I never had a breakdown, but I simply made a rational decision to escape their toxicity. She desperately begged to know the real truth. A tiny part of my brain wanted to keep the secret buried forever, but I finally realized that she might actually be completely brainwashed by their constant lies. So I asked her if she remembered the specific holiday when I was 22 years old. I asked if she remembered the time I drove 4 hours just to find the door locked because they gave my spot at the table to her new boyfriend and left my dinner rotting in a cheap plastic box on the porch. Kelsey stared at me in total horror and vigorously shook her head. She stuttered that our mom had promised her that I simply had to work late and could not make the drive that year. I firmly corrected her and swore that I was physically standing right on that freezing porch and that it was not the first time they had treated me like garbage, but it was absolutely the final straw. I listed off all the other painful memories. I reminded her about the time I slept on the floor so her boyfriend could take the bed, and the time they went on a secret beach vacation without me, and all the birthdays that were canceled just for her convenience. I explicitly told her that every single time our parents had to choose between her minor comfort and my actual existence, they eagerly chose her without a single moment of hesitation. She started sobbing hysterically and swore that she never explicitly asked them to hurt me. I calmly agreed that she never asked them to do it, but I firmly pointed out that she absolutely never bothered to notice it happening either. I told her that completely ignoring the blatant abuse for years was a conscious choice in itself. She stood there crying a genuinely ugly and involuntary cry that she would have been totally mortified by if she could see herself. She swore she had absolutely no idea how bad things truly were, and honestly, I actually believed her. She was never the evil mastermind behind my suffering, but she was definitely the happy beneficiary of it, and while that distinction is important, it absolutely does not erase the massive trauma I endured. She desperately asked how she could possibly fix the massive divide between us. I honestly told her that I had absolutely no idea if it could ever be repaired. I explained that I had spent the last 7 years carefully constructing a beautiful reality where I never have to beg for a tiny scrap of basic respect, and I was absolutely not willing to risk destroying my peace for her or anyone else. I told her that for now we were simply co-workers and complete strangers, and that was the absolute most I could possibly offer her. She wiped her tear-soaked face with her sleeve and suddenly looked incredibly young and vulnerable. She offered a final broken apology and admitted she knew I probably would not believe her words. I softly replied that I fully believed she was sorry about how painful the current situation was, but I heavily doubted she was actually truly sorry for the decades of toxic behavior that ultimately caused the pain in the first place. She slowly nodded her head in defeat and walked away into the shadows of the garage. I climbed into my truck and drove home to my peaceful life. That intense garage confrontation happened about 4 months ago, and here is exactly where everything currently stands today. Roughly 6 weeks after our talk, Kelsey officially transferred to our company branch located all the way out in Portland. On her absolute final day in the Boise office, she cautiously approached my desk to say goodbye and timidly asked if she could give me a hug. I reluctantly allowed it. It was incredibly brief and totally awkward, but she smelled exactly like the same cheap shampoo she used back in high school, and the familiar scent almost completely shattered my heavy emotional armor. We absolutely do not text or call each other, but she did send me a professional request to connect on social media, which I quietly accepted because it feels like the safest amount of distance for us right now. My parents immediately fled back to Ohio the very next morning after I destroyed them in the hotel room. My dad's nasty text message about my mom crying was the absolute last communication I received from him. For an entire month, there was nothing but beautiful silence. And then sometime in late November, a thick physical envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was a 3-page handwritten letter from my mom. I am definitely not going to expose every private detail of her letter on the internet, but I will share the most important revelation. She dedicated a massive portion of the letter to talking about the plastic container. She confessed that after our brutal hotel confrontation, she went straight back to her house and frantically tore through all her kitchen cabinets, desperately searching for that specific container, even though she clearly knew I had taken it away 7 years ago. She admitted that she finally found the exact shelf where the matching set was kept and stared at the empty gap where the missing box used to sit. She wrote that she collapsed right onto the hard kitchen floor and sobbed uncontrollably because that exact empty gap had been staring her in the face for 7 entire years, and she had been so incredibly blind and selfish that she never even noticed it was missing. She offered a profound apology and revealed that she had officially started attending intense weekly therapy sessions to work on her massive flaws. She mentioned that my dad was still stubbornly refusing to admit any fault, but she was actively pushing him to change. She explicitly stated that she did not expect or demand any response from me, but she desperately needed me to know that she finally heard my pain and that leaving that container on the porch was the absolute worst mistake she had ever made in her entire life. I slowly read the heavy letter twice and then quietly locked it away deep inside my desk drawer. I still have not written a single word back to her, and honestly, I have absolutely no idea if I ever will. My own personal therapist recently told me that my total silence proves I am finally learning how to prioritize my own mental health, and that the lingering guilt I occasionally feel is just a toxic leftover reflex from spending 22 years being systematically trained to put myself in last place. Things with Jess are incredibly wonderful. We are stronger than ever. The other night, she wrapped her arms around me and whispered that she was incredibly proud of my strength. When I asked her why, she smiled and said she was proud of me for never pretending that the trauma did not matter, but also for refusing to let the trauma completely consume my future. I am absolutely going to marry that incredible woman one day soon. As for the infamous plastic container, it currently sits proudly on the very top shelf of our kitchen pantry, right hidden safely behind the large mixing bowls. I do not pull it out or stare at it very often, but I am always hyper aware that it is sitting right there. Jess once asked me why I still hold on to such a painful object, and at the time I told her I honestly did not know. But looking back now, I finally realize exactly why I kept it. I keep it because it is my ultimate physical proof. It is not just proof that my toxic family treated me like complete garbage, because I definitely do not need a piece of old plastic to validate that painful reality. I hold on to it because it is absolute, undeniable proof that I was strong enough to survive their abuse. It is solid proof that I was brave enough to pick up that pathetic scrap of rejection off a freezing porch in Ohio and carry it thousands of miles away to build a completely new reality where leaving someone locked outside with a doggy bag is absolutely unthinkable. I built a beautiful life where my front door is always wide open for the people I truly love and where there is always a guaranteed seat at my table. I keep that old box because every single time I happen to glance at it tucked safely away inside a beautiful kitchen that I personally own, inside a gorgeous house that I purchased with my own hard work while living an incredible life that I specifically chose for myself, it serves as the ultimate reminder of exactly how incredibly far I have climbed out of the darkness. If you manage to stick around and read this massive story all the way to the very end, I truly want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I kept this heavy secret locked inside my chest for 7 long years, and it feels incredibly liberating to finally release it into the universe. If any tiny part of my journey sounds even remotely familiar to your own life, and if you are currently standing completely frozen on a cold porch, just desperately waiting for someone to finally unlock a door that is permanently bolted shut, I desperately need you to realize that you have the absolute power to just turn around and walk away forever. And I promise you that the beautiful and peaceful life you eventually build for yourself will be infinitely larger and more fulfilling than the tiny, suffocating space they constantly refuse to make for you. Please just trust me on that one.